Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from today, and welcome to MDV's first webinar of 2020, A Certain Something, Assessing Leaders for Uncertain Times. My name is Melanie Long, and I'm a partner at MDV Consulting, and I'm joined here today by Mike Vesey.
Good morning, or good afternoon.
Managing partner of MDV, and we're absolutely delighted to have so many of you on the call today. We've actually got a mix of clients, potential clients, people who are interested in adult development, and also members of our Research and Innovation Alliance. So welcome. Can I just check that everybody can hear us today? Great. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. So let's, just in terms of a few sort of running details, we are going to run this webinar until 1 p.m. GMT, and we're planning to share content for about 45 minutes of that hour. We're going to reserve the final 15 minutes for questions, and we will have everyone on mute today. So if you do have any questions, either during or towards the end of the call, please can you submit them through the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on this and aim to respond to all of your questions. If we don't get to them all, we will provide responses after the webinar and send them round to everyone who's attended. The other thing I just need to let you know is that we are actually recording the call today. So in terms of our agenda, what are we going to cover? So before joining MDV last year, I'd worked at BP, where I'd held a number of talent and assessment leadership positions. And my experience within BP and within my network was that organisations are being increasingly challenged to identify and prepare leaders to step up and navigate hugely complex challenges that have no precedent. At the same time, I was also noticing that as HR leaders and professionals, we were having to rely on the same talent assessment and development practices and processes that we'd relied on for as long as I can remember. And there really felt like there was a disconnect between what we were offering and what leaders needed and wanted. And the variable enthusiasm of leaders to many of the practices reinforced this belief for me. So when I moved to MDV, I was really keen to get the view of other HR leaders. What was their experience and perspective on the relevance of assessment and development practices, and did they see the need for something different? In today's webinar, we are keen to share the findings from our recent research with leading organisations, which suggests that we are at a key inflection point as an HR profession and have the opportunity to step into some new ways of operating that will better serve our organisations and leaders for now and the future. We'll provide a perspective on why we believe it's time to move beyond leadership competencies and what might fill the gap. We'll provide an alternative path that we believe is of its time, relevant for leaders and organisations, that capitalises on the traditions of adult development theory. We'll share our experience of working with adult development and how this is helping organisations to identify and develop leaders' capacity to lead differently, as well as provide a foundation for transforming broader talent and development practices. So what did we actually focus on in our research? Well, we conducted a series of one-to-one interviews, and we also used a survey with a range of HR and talent leaders in a number of organisations. And we were pursuing a number of lines of inquiry. So firstly, are steady state realities a distant memory? What are the predominant disruptive forces that organisations are experiencing? And are all organisations feeling the same effect? What is the impact on leaders? So are all leaders at all levels and in all parts of the organisation affected? Or are the impacts more localised and targeted? And how important is it that organisations know which leaders can step up and into complexity? What's the right yardstick by which to assess leadership today? What is the role of assessment? Is it still important and is it still relevant? And what is required of the industry moving forwards? So let's take a look at some of the findings that emerged. When asked to what extent organisations were facing complexity and disruption, the findings were pretty clear. A high proportion of organisations said they were facing significant uncertainty and change, Whether driven by internal forces or external forces, organisations are having to change and transform in new and different ways to stay relevant, stay compliant, and stay ahead. Furthermore, few leaders are immune to this complexity, but not all are similarly affected. Sector, industry, and organisational context are key determinants of who is facing the most extreme headwinds. Whilst the top tiers of leadership in most organisations are facing into the storms, there are groups of quite junior leaders who are also grappling with complexity. So we can't just assume this is a concern for the top of the house. When asked, are leaders ready to navigate the disruption, responses suggested that how leaders respond to complexity varies greatly. While some may not know how to make sense of what they're facing into, they're acting with a sense of urgency and enthusiasm. Others are hiding their head in the sand and viewing complexity as something that's still out there and far off, with future of work projects kept at arm's length from business as usual, with limited frontline leadership involvement. A number of hypotheses were mooted as to why this might be happening. Leaders overwhelmed by complexity, leaders fearing failure associated with stepping into the unknown, and a reluctance to move away from what they know and their prevailing operating mode and what has made them successful historically. Do organisations need to identify leaders equipped to tackle these disruptive forces? Perhaps unsurprisingly, having leaders able to navigate and make sense of complexity and thrive in such a deeply uncertain world will seem to be unanimously important. When asked to quantify the proportion of leadership positions that require leaders capable of leading this way, on average, organisations suggested that 60% of leadership positions required this type of capability. We then asked organisations how they measure leadership to get a sense for whether competencies are still widely used and relevant. Leadership competencies, the yardstick by which we typically assess, recruit and develop leaders, were perceived by many as outdated and designed for the past, not the future. Despite this, competencies were almost unanimously identified as the primary measure of leadership, possibly as there was little certainty about what could or should take their place. We asked talent and HR leaders how relevant is assessment in their organisations and how widely is it used. Pretty much all of the organisations we spoke to use assessment. However, beyond the top level of leadership, where it is consistently adopted, how, when and why it's used varies widely. Beyond talent identification, the level of integration of assessment with core people processes varies greatly. Regardless of the variation, there is a recognition that the insights from assessment should be powerful enablers for decision making and inform and inframe people-related activities, be it leadership recruitment, development, talent identification, or succession planning. And there was definitely appetite to make better use of these potentially valuable insights. Despite assessment being seen as relevant, the practices being fairly widespread, and the insights being perceived as having potential to add value across people processes, there was a real question mark over whether the technologies used are keeping up. A sense that not as lot has changed in assessment, whilst everything has changed for leaders, emerged during the interviews. And at the same time, whilst believing something else was needed, what that might look like remained unanswered. Perhaps more worryingly, when asked whether the insights organisations are getting from assessment are helping them identify who in the pipeline can step up and navigate the complexity faced by their organisations, the level of confidence was pretty low. So overall, our research revealed that there is a real sense that change is needed. The industry and associated talent practices need to take some big steps forward to keep up with the pace of business change and remain relevant and able to deliver the type of transformational insight and development that leaders need. But, and here is the rub, no one wants to adopt a fad that will disenfranchise stakeholders and lack the rigour and credentials to stand up to scrutiny. Whilst there's recognition that the assessment industry does need to play catch up, there's a real concern about falling foul of untested approaches that lack substance and the associated unintended consequences on stakeholders, the leaders, and the business. Solid theory, science, and practice are needed along with face validity to ensure relevance, resonance, and acceptance among leadership. The question, therefore, is what can bridge the gap? What is there that can replace competencies? How can we identify and develop leaders for an uncertain future? How do we remain relevant and at the same time deliver the rigor that our stakeholders expect? At MDV, we spent the last 5 years exploring this dilemma against a backdrop which even in that time has become more uncertain and more complex. Working with leading theorists and practitioners in the world of adult development, we found a way forward that we believe honours best practice of the past, but at the same time shines a light on an established, highly relevant perspective that can help leaders access and draw upon wiser ways of operating that go beyond traditional leadership competencies, traits and skills, and help leaders think, act and relate in different and more expansive ways for a world that is truly uncertain.
Thank you, Mel. So what is it about this complexity that seems to be outstripping our ability to keep up? And how is it that leaders really need to change in the way that they are leading? This is a concept that we've taken from our friend Otto Lasky. Job one, any of us has a job one, the task that we have to deliver, the accountabilities. Why does the role exist? Our task two, or our job two, is to develop ourselves to meet the challenges of delivering the task in job one. In this scales illustration on the far left, there's a perfect balance between the demands of the role, job one, and the capabilities of the person in order to fulfill that job. So far, so good. In the middle set of scales, we see that the individual has a surplus capacity, surplus to the requirements or complexity of the role. So this will be a prime candidate to move to a more stretched position. Lastly, we see job one outstripping the person's capability to keep up. And this is a more common refrain when we hear people talking about being in over their heads or running ever faster to stand still. One of the most useful frames that we have come across in the last 5-6 years of working in the realm of adult development theory is Dave Snowden's Competency framework. This framework looks at the relationship between cause and effect. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a world that many of us perhaps grew up in and many of our leaders were socialized in. And that's a world that is, broadly speaking, predictable. In the obvious domain, cause and effect are known, repeatable, and predictable. This is a world of operations. This is a world where leaders can delegate, automate, and look for process efficiency. This is a world where we need to mine for best practice that can be repeated. Many of our leaders, particularly in the newer industries, the knowledge worker type industries, are used to operating in the complicated space. Here, cause and effect are broadly known or can be predicted or can be researched, but there might be some separation between time and space. So, for example, we bring together a group of experts to consider a particular problem, and through working through a largely agreed methodology, we can arrive at the right answer. So there is a right answer, there is agreement as to what would be a good solution. This is the realm, therefore, of good practice. And our hypothesis is that many leaders have grown up in a world that was, broadly speaking, more predictable, and yet are now facing a context which has moved over to the left-hand side of this diagram and are operating in an unpredictable world. In the complex domain, cause and effect are not known, are not repeatable. And very often when you have a problem or an issue that falls in the complex space, we don't even have agreement amongst key stakeholders as to what is the issue or problem statement, let alone what might be the solution. And that's a recipe for conflict and disagreement. So the mantra here from the Competency framework in the complex space is to tread gently, to scan the system and to look for safe to fail experimentation to start to tease out what in fact might be cause and effect. Now, many of the clients we work with, as soon as you start to talk about safe to fail experimentation, they're very quick to point out that if you're delivering legal advice to a client, if you're delivering them a consumer product, if you're in the oil and gas sector, or you're running an airline, that is not a safe to fail environment, or at least the end product cannot be filled with. However, that still leaves much space to experiment within this system without affecting the end product. And many people, I think, are often reticent about experimenting for all of those fears that come with it. And then finally, on the bottom left, we've got an environment that is chaotic, where all hell has broken loose. And invariably, that happens when something that has been operating in the obvious falls over. And I experienced this only at the weekend when I was trying to fly back to London from Zurich. Airlines normally run to a timetable, and I arrived at Zurich Airport to find that Storm Ciara had other ideas, and looked at the departure board, which was flashing red for the whole of Northern Europe. And it often can be our tendency when something has fallen over and fallen into the chaotic to want to shove it back into the obvious as quickly as we possibly can. And invariably, we make the problem worse in doing so. What the Cynefin framework helps us to understand is that first we need to stabilize the situation in the chaotic, and once it's stabilized, we can start to move the problem into the complex, to experiment, because the house is no longer on fire, and eventually we might be able to move it back around into complicated, get the experts to do their detailed analytical work about what's really going on, and then finally we might be able to move it back into obvious. So I'd hope that there will be a key takeaway from today's session, in that you might use the Cynefin framework to look at what problems is your organisation facing right now, where would you place them on that Cynefin framework, or where would you pull them apart and put different facets of the problem on that framework, and are you tackling them in the right way as suggested by the framework? And Cynefin provides a useful segue into this next slide. So many of us as practitioners grew up in the predictable world, and we learnt our craft looking at the various traits or personal attributes, intelligences, etc. of a person, and how a person might express those various attributes in terms of behavioural competencies. So what's going on inside the person, and what behaviours do they express, or what competencies do they express on the outside. And that kind of framework worked okay as long as we could peep around the corner into the middle distance and say, what type of behaviours or competencies do we need our leaders to have? And then we could go about assessing people for those various attributes and make predictions about how well they were likely to be able to learn to demonstrate those given competencies. If you follow our premise that we're now operating more in an unpredictable world, we've identified 5 capabilities on the top right there that we believe help leaders to move from a complicated space, in Cynefin terms, to a complex space. And if those are the capabilities or the expression that leaders need to have to navigate this new environment, then we're interested in looking at some of the underlying capacity that someone might have in order to develop and express those capabilities. And over the last 5 years, we've been working alongside leading practitioners and theorists in the world of constructivist adult development, including the likes of Otto Lasky, Jennifer Garvey-Berger, Karen Ellis and Julie Allen, who's on the call today from our Research Alliance, to bring together the best of this thinking. And we've taken a polymath approach here, really looking to find the best of the best and to create an integrated model which represents the 4 capacities or 4 aspects of our meaning-making system that you can see at the bottom right here. And unlike traits and abilities, which we were always taught are pretty fixed, the good news about these developmental capacities is that they can indeed be developed. There is no ceiling on what a leader can or can't do. The capabilities, if you like, the enacted capacities, provide a structure around which we've been able to hang a range of practical habits, tools, development tips that can be used by leaders to build their capacity to navigate complexity. And we at MDV believe this is a critical addition to understanding individuals' capabilities and gives organisations the competitive advantage they need by creating more agile leaders. And whilst we still measure the usual styles, traits and intellectual capabilities, mostly because in fact clients still want us to, and they are indeed helpful, we also want to be able to access and understand the way in which individuals make sense of information, their relationships, and the world around them. And this is where we're delving into the world of meaning making or sense making. Not the way in which someone behaves, but the way in which they know. And people are not always aware of these frames of their knowing, and therefore we, through our assessment practice, we externalize this or bring it into the known domain. So we therefore believe that we need to move beyond the traditional self-report, questionnaires, psychometric tools, and traditional competence-based interview techniques towards tools and techniques that enable us to go beyond what someone is saying to focus on how they are saying it and how they come to know what they are saying. Their sense-making processes across a thinking or conceptual strand, an interpersonal or relating strand, and an intrapersonal domain or strand, how I manage myself. And we also draw on specific tools which add some additional power to the interview. So for example, we're finding we're using the cognitive process profile from Cognidev to augment our interview practice. Now, our assessment approach has always been developmental. It has always had a distinctively holistic or developmental approach, whether it is in fact used for selection, promotion, or talent identification. So we like to take an inside-out approach rather than assessing from the outside, judging a person clipboard and stopwatch in hand. So we seek to get close to the individual in a person-centric manner. And what that means is we help people reflect on their own unique experiences and patterns of behaviour. We help them identify core underlying characteristics, capacities, values and drivers, and to reflect upon what has served them well in the past and what might help them realise their future aspirations and what is at risk of being overplayed or they might want to change in some way. We also take a holistic view. So rather than dissecting people into a series of separate components, scores, scales, or competencies, we work with individuals to develop a holistic understanding of what makes them distinctive as a leader. And this enables us and them to gain powerful insights into both performance and potential. And the way in which we work with people, we seek to make this an engaging experience. So developmental assessment is something we do with people, not to them. We work in a transparent and relational, quite adult to adult way, encouraging participants to open up and engage in self-exploration to focus their energy and attention on accelerating their self-development. And this experience sparks a participant's own internal drive to develop, because people are left with the insight, motivation and wherewithal to address their own challenges, and hence the developmental impact. The assessment is also looking at an individual's leadership in context. So we're very interested in understanding that job one, job two match, and how do the demands of the role marry up with an individual's capabilities, and where might there be some gaps. We record all our interviews so that a transcript can be analysed for structure and not for content. The interview transcript is also peer-reviewed, which not only provides greater reliability by reducing the risk of bias, given the review is conducted by someone with no knowledge of the candidate. And whilst the detailed content of the transcript remains confidential, we draw out themes to inform the developmental assessment profile, providing snippets of text for the client, both against the behavioural frameworks that might be being used, but also a person's overall stage of development and their ability to meet the complexity demands of the role or of future roles. And then in our reporting, as I've already referenced, we are reporting still on preferences, styles, traits, abilities, the things we've come to know and love from the past, and how these might be helpful or less helpful in any given context and the leadership outputs that are required, whilst also gauging the degree to which an individual may be capable of flexing these to changing circumstances. But we go beyond that traditional reporting to also give a view on the 4 developmental capacities that I mentioned earlier, which will underpin a person's ability to navigate complexity. And those break down namely into 2 conceptual strands, or cognitive strand, the effectiveness of one's thinking, the amount of complexity a person is able to absorb, and the fluidity of someone's thinking. So here we're looking at how does someone relate to the world of ideas, models, frameworks, professional disciplines, etc., and how flexible, innovative, or fluid is their thinking. We're also looking at an interpersonal or relational strand. So that's how does a person relate to others that they know and to the wider social environment in which they operate. And then finally, a personal or an intrapersonal or emotional strand. How does the person relate to themselves and their inner world of thoughts and feelings? And as I also alluded to earlier, we then also provide concrete development actions accompanied by relevant habits, tools, practices, which help leaders quickly increase their awareness or adapt their practice to build their capacity for complexity. Now, given that this is relatively new for many organisations, and given some of the scepticism that might be out there or the concern to make sure that these things aren't just fads, our Research Alliance has been conducting some quite heavy-duty research over the last couple of years. And our research revealed that organisations really felt that we needed to have an evidence base for what we're doing here. So the Research and Innovation Alliance was created as a collaborative creation between people working in the field of adult development, and it exists to research, build and accelerate our collective knowledge of vertical development practices and theories. And the Alliance has spent the last year conducting an in-depth review of the theory, literature and evidence to give our clients the certainty that this is in fact a fact and not a fad. But it is a well-established tradition that's time has come. And our latest report, Certain Uncertainties, looks at the evidence base for vertical development, the theoretical underpinnings, the methodologies for measuring developmental stage, and its perceived utility and impact in organisations. And the report contains much more that we're not able to cover today, but if you're interested, you can download this report for free from the MDV website, and details will be provided at the end of this webinar.
So a busy slide which is in the report, so we won't be going through it in detail, but really what we wanted to bring out here was that certainly adult development is not a new area or uncharted territory, and theorists and practitioners have been studying adult research since the 1950s, and a variety of lines of investigation from different areas of research, including psychology, education, organisational research into adult development, suggests that people can and do continue to progress in recognisable ways in their way of meaning making in their adult lives. The work that identifies distinct stages, or if you like, expansion of meaning making, highlights individuals' increasing ability to work with complexity and uncertainty, and ability to navigate towards a judgment in the absence of a single correct solution. As we'd expect with any assessment technology, it's critical to ensure that it works. And the 2 concepts of most interest to us here are reliability and validity. The good news is there is a good body of evidence pointing to the reliability, if you like, the accuracy of different tools measuring developmental stage, whether it's sentence completion forms, interviews, or simulations such as the cognitive process profile that Mike mentioned earlier. There's also a fair amount of evidence of construct validity, i.e. that the measures that we're using are actually picking up something associated with adult development as described by their underpinning theories. As ever, in this field and in any field, we're always looking to do more research, and MDV is actively building a database with data covering different forms and tools to start to explore how the cross-comparison of the different approaches used to tap into stages of meaning making. I think the significance of face validity is often underestimated, yet in our assessment research, one of the reasons some of the organisations we spoke to were reluctant to try something different was fear of stakeholder reaction. Would leaders think it was credible? Would HR leaders buy in on behalf of their clients? However, personal experience of a developmental assessment underpinned by adult development can be a really powerful thing. It can create rich discussions, open up new insight, and catalyse people's willingness to practice, experiment, and challenge themselves. And leaders we've worked with find the approach refreshing. It's meeting them where they're at by recognising the complexity they're facing. Often sceptical of assessment, our experience has been that leaders appreciate the interview, the chance to reflect on current challenges and problems, and to examine and explore their own leadership. And I think, as Mike touched on earlier, we also find the practical nature of the development advice and tips is very well received. So we're not just saying be more assertive or develop more gravitas, which you can often see in some assessment reports, but we're genuinely helping leaders to get to a very granular level of insight and to give them practical habits and tools that they can use on the job to adapt and respond. We know this approach is reliable, we know it has good construct validity, a strong face validity, and that it really resonates with leaders. However, an obvious question that is on all of our minds is about whether it makes an impact on the business. So are leaders who have more expanded ways of making sense of the world more effective? And as with any form of validation, studies of real-world impact of adult development in the form of concurrent or predictive validation studies are relatively thin on the ground, often due to sample size or the challenge of actually defining what you constitute by organisational performance. However, they do exist. So here you can see an example of a study that looked at developmental stage as measured by interview with measures of leadership effectiveness in a group of chief executives and middle managers. And more developed leaders were found to be more effective against a number of criteria, including solving problems, managing conflict, and so on. Further studies have also been identified, and you'll find them in our report, Certain Uncertainties, but another one that looked at participants on a global leadership master's program at the World Economic Forum. And at the end of the program, participants who were rated through assessment by an external search firm as having high leadership potential had also been found to be later in their development than those rated as having less. And as I said, there are many more studies that you can review in our white paper if you're interested. So we said earlier on that we think this has value as an approach both for leaders, but also more broadly. So what I wanted to just touch on is some of those other areas that we believe that this approach really can act as a foundation for transformation. Assessing potential, so that issue of trying to identify who has the ability to take on more senior leadership roles with greater scope and complexity and at an accelerated pace has always been challenging. I know from my time in-house as a talent leader, too often potential is conflated with performance and even readiness, and judging how much potential and for what is really problematic. But interestingly, as we look at typical factors of potential and we look at our developmental capacities, there are some similarities. Openness to learning is also a factor which is believed to contribute to accelerated progression on the developmental capacities, and learning agility is one characteristic, often cited as important for potential. So what we're seeing is both of these are trying to understand some of the core qualities of an individual, getting under the surface of those expressed behaviours to understand future runway. But with the developmental capacities, we can be a bit more specific, perhaps, than with the traditional focus on potential. We can look at how the complexity of a person's future role or their current role, job one as Mike referred to, matches up in terms of their capacity to handle the complexity, so job two. Do they actually need to develop new ways of thinking about the world, relationships and themselves to be more effective in their role or context? Or might they already have the capacity to handle even greater complexity? And we think this could be a fruitful way to combine assessment of potential with readiness. We're also finding that the aggregate insights from developmental assessments can make a really significant impact on program design for leadership development, being able to target not only specific capacities, but also consider the predominant stage of meaning making of a cohort to shape a program that creates catalyzing conditions for change, what Nick Petrie might call heat experiences, but not be overwhelming or underwhelming. And the application of our tools, practice and habits that are both tailored to capacity and developmental stage means we can create a highly bespoke program using well-proven tools and techniques. We're also finding the same is true of coaching. So often coaching relationships can start with an assumption that someone really knows what they need to change and focus in on. I need to be more assertive, I'm overloaded, I'm overwhelmed, I'm not strategic enough. But it's too easy to fall into the trap of addressing the presenting issue. With a developmental assessment as the foundation of a coaching relationship, individual needs can be pinpointed, providing an evidence-based pathway for coaching that we're finding highly impactful. We're also starting to see a shift in how team development is approached, working with teams to explore whether they are sufficiently mature for the we space and the task that is before the team, and whether they're acting in an upwardly or downwardly developmental way. And the final area we're starting to see some hope in is in terms of D&I, which in Cynefin terms truly is a complex problem. And of the many enablers of D&I, the role of leaders is probably one of the most pivotal. How they embrace the perspectives and thoughts of all and start to see and move beyond their own biases. Many attempts to define behaviours needed of leaders to be inclusive has been made, and I'm not sure personally that they've made much difference. Through our work, we're starting to see how conversations about specific developmental capacities are shifting the way in which leaders are thinking about D&I. So initially rooted in dialogues around specific issues such as the gender pay gap in the UK, leaders are viewing D&I through a much more expansive lens and are shifting their focus towards deeper root causes and influences on D&I, such as the impact of their behaviour and the choices they make. Through development, leaders are also becoming aware that their meaning making has been shaped and authored by their gender background and culture. So be able to actually see your culture as a thing and understand how that might be different from how someone else makes sense of the world in and of itself is a developmental shift towards a later stage, helping individuals to transcend things like background. So we've come to the end of our formal content, and we've got a few minutes left for questions. So if you do have questions that you want to pose at this stage, if you wouldn't mind popping them into chat, we'd be really delighted to answer any that you might have. So I think we've got a question in terms of level of leadership, Mike. So people are asking, what sort of level of leadership is this type of assessment most appropriately used for?
So I think our experience thus far, given the amount of time and therefore the price point of this type of assessment, was analysing a 40-page transcript. Does take some time. Most people are using this more at the top of the house for more senior leaders, but I think, as you said earlier, Mel, often we can find that seniority in the hierarchy doesn't necessarily correspond with complexity. So you might have, in hierarchical terms, more junior employees who, for whatever reason, don't have any positional power, any budgets within the organisation, but are having to navigate quite a complex set of matrix structures in order to get things done. And therefore, this type of approach would be exactly relevant for that type of person.
Thanks, Mike. And we've got another question that's just come in. Oh, they're all coming in. Wow. So I'm just reading them. So keep them coming. So how have you integrated your assessments with companies' competency models and any existing potential models so it doesn't feel overwhelming or confusing? What a great question.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So in our reporting at the moment, we are doing both. We are reporting against the client's competency model and using the traditional sort of traits and behaviours that you would report there, and we're giving a lens on the developmental capacities. Now, does that overload people? I think not, because they are measuring different facets of a person. And we had a beautiful selection example the other week where the candidate, if you just looked at how they were performing against the client's traditional behavioural competency framework, would have been appointed. But as we'd analysed the role through talking to the HRD and the hiring manager, the candidate wasn't stepping up to meet the level of thinking complexity, relationship complexity that this more senior role would involve. And therefore, we were able to show from a developmental capacity perspective that the person was not yet ready for the role. And the HRD and the managing director were very thankful, therefore, that we'd saved them making yet another wrong move, because they had, in fact, appointed two people previously who hadn't been successful. So that was really helpful then in shining both those lenses on the individual.
Fabulous, and yeah, very important decision. We've got another question here, Mike. What's the relationship between capabilities and capacities, and what does MDV assess?
Yeah, so it can start to get a bit of a tongue twister, can't it? So our definition is that the capabilities are the expression, what you actually see someone doing in the real world, the outcomes. The capacities are the underlying things that are going on within a person, that if they were to develop that capacity, they would be able then to express or deliver those outcomes. So in our assessments, we are looking at someone's capacity to move into a more senior role, because they may not yet have had that exposure or experience. Sometimes in our development work, we are either focusing at one or other, but invariably not both, because to our earlier question, that can get confusing for people if it sounds like we've got too many frameworks and too much psychobabble.
Brilliant. And we've got another question. So thank you, very informative. How best can someone get started using this perspective? So how can you light some fires? What would you recommend?
Well, I'd use the Cynefin framework and say, go where there's energy and where can you experiment in a safe to fail type of way. So that might be looking at pilots in small areas. It might be working with the grain where you've got a particular client group that is saying, we're noticing we've got a lot of complexity here and we want to experiment or try something new. Or you might have a stakeholder who is willing to undergo a developmental assessment on a pilot or a trial basis.
Yeah. And certainly I think that latter approach has worked really well, where people experience it themselves, and once you sort of opened the toothpaste, they really want to use it. Okay, we've got some other questions coming in. So how long in your experience does it take to further develop in relation to those 4 capacities?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I think what we are not seeking to do is to yank someone up by the hair and say, you must be developed. We don't have the right to do that. And a shift in someone's meaning-making structure is a long process. So better, we think, is to focus people on tools, habits and practices that they can actually deploy in the job that start to build increased capability, and therefore job 1 and job 2 are better aligned with one another. And our hypothesis is if someone continues to deploy those habits and practices over time, they will start to reverse into a meaning-making shift, or they will start to develop and realize some of those capacities. So we focus very much on the practical, the tools, habits, practices that someone can use in their day job, that someone of a more mature developmental stage may already be using, and we can bring those into the realm of experience for someone who might be earlier in their stage of development. And there's a second part of that in terms of intelligence and IQ. I mean, it used to be very frustrating if you'd assessed a person to say, well, that's how you are, and that's fixed. I guess the evidence shows that a degree of intellectual horsepower is required to move through a developmental stage, because some of the things that you're trying to grapple with, holding two seemingly conflicting ideas in your head at any given time while still operating and not going mad, does require a degree of intellectual dexterity. However, it's not a straight line linear relationship between traditional measures of IQ or intelligence and someone's capacity to develop further.
And next question, really fascinating actually, and it takes me back to some conversations we were having around, post-conventional people in a conventional organisation. You do see areas where a further developed person has a disadvantage compared to someone who is at an earlier stage?
Well, certainly as I've got older, and I noticed that I might be mulling over some issues far more than I did in my younger, earlier self. We are not for 1 minute claiming that someone who is later in their development, that this is a panacea for health, happiness, wealth, etc., because we start to notice more, and that can cause us to go round in the washing machine sometimes a little more as well. I think that potentially in the workplace there might be some disadvantages in organisations that are very goal orientated and just want people to get on with it, to get on the bus and not ask awkward questions or not overcomplicate things. And when working with people who are later in their development, if they're having that feedback, we might use the concept of enabling constraints. How might someone not reduce complexity to a simplistic hashtag, but to recognise the context within which they're working, and that not every situation or every stakeholder wants to see all of that complexity or thinking. And I think the other disadvantage we can see as one becomes potentially more powerful and more impactful as one moves through developmental stages, the issues of ethics become increasingly to the fore, because throughout human history, I think we have seen people who are quite sophisticated in their stage of development, and without a moral compass, obviously those capabilities can be used for good or for ill. So I think that is another disadvantage, potentially, if you have people with dark sides to their later stage development.
Great, thanks, Mike. I think we're running up just towards the end of the webinar. So if there are any other questions, please do continue to add them. But really just a couple of points we wanted to raise. So firstly, just to say thank you so much for joining our webinar today and for the great questions and comments that you've all shared. And if there are other questions that come through, what we will do is make sure that we send responses out to those, to everyone who's attended today. We are going to share the recording later this week. And if what you've heard today has whetted your appetite, please visit our website where you can access our white papers and articles and much more. So they're all freely available. So we've provided you links on the slides. But also, we'd love to hear from you. So please do get in touch. If it's just to have a conversation about your views or how to light the fires, as some of you have said, or think about how it might be relevant for your organisation, we would love to hear from you. We will be sending a short feedback survey, which we'd love you to respond to. Only a few questions, but just to give us feedback on how we can make sure that future webinars are as valuable as possible, and certainly watch this space. There'll be more to come this year. So on behalf of Mike and myself, I would just like to thank you all for taking the time out today, joining us on the journey. We're excited about it and excited about its opportunity, particularly in a very complex 2020. And if you want to hear more, Mike is actually going to be speaking with Wanda Wallace on Valentine's Day, I think Friday the 14th of February on Voice of America. This is being advertised through LinkedIn, and there will be a podcast. If you can't listen live, there will be a recording, and he'll be talking more about some of these ideas and some of the issues with Wanda, who's a phenomenal person to talk to as well.
She sure is.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you. Have a great rest of the day, evening, morning, and we hope to see and speak to many of you in the coming months.
Thanks very much. Go well.